Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating strategic document. Think about this monumental challenge. How do you design, manage, and actually execute a plan for millions of people living in some of the most volatile environments on Earth? Well, we're diving into the strategic guide for the UNRWA Director of Planning. And look, this isn't just your standard dry corporate roadmap. No, it's a profound look at how an agency operating right in the middle of protracted displacement, constantly escalating needs, and, recurring funding shocks, somehow manages to keep its vital, life-saving operations afloat. So I want to pose a question directly to you. How do you plan for the completely unpredictable? Seriously, put yourself in the shoes of a humanitarian leader for a second. Your daily operating environment is defined by sudden conflict, restricted access, and overnight shifts in funding. In a normal corporate setting, right, a sudden disruption just means a dip in quarterly profits. But in the context of UNRWA, a disruption means a sudden halt in essential, life-saving services for Palestine refugees. You are literally planning inside a pressure cooker where human lives depend on your ability to somehow forecast the unknown. Okay, let's dive into this. The strategy gives us a really powerful anchor right off the bat. Planning cannot be treated as a purely procedural function. In a massive, highly bureaucratic United Nations framework, it is just incredibly easy for planning to become exactly that, a tedious paperwork exercise. But here, in this context, planning is elevated to an urgent, dynamic leadership discipline. It's basically the critical muscle that translates a high-level mandate, hard evidence, and harsh field realities into coherent, actionable choices that just have to be implemented under immense pressure. Because of all that pressure, the director of planning has to act as a senior integrator. Think of this role as the connective tissue of the entire agency. The guide actually introduces a highly practical blueprint provided by Basel El-Habil. He's a leader whose deep field experience, spanning everything from emergency adaptation and vocational planning to keeping services running under extreme constraints, shows us exactly what it takes. A successful planner absolutely must have both rigid analytical discipline and a deep empathy for what's actually happening on the ground. They literally have to bring order to chaos. They're linking that big long-term vision directly to daily field priorities and, of course, very strict financial realities. Moving on to Section 1, Strategy and Reality, Bridging the Gap. We really have to ask, how does a high-level headquarters strategy actually survive contact with the harsh realities on the ground? Because let's be real, a strategy that only exists in a cushy boardroom is pretty much useless when your staff, very limited budgets, and sudden crises inevitably collide out in the field. Just look at the operational map. UNRW is running things across 5 vastly different regions: Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. A centralized one-size-fits-all approach? Yeah, that completely fails across these regions. Why? Because the security conditions, the legal constraints, the specific host government arrangements, and honestly, even just basic infrastructure vary dramatically from one location to the next. So the planning function absolutely has to provide shared analytical tools and common standards, but it must allow for field-specific adaptation if it's going to maintain any sort of real operational relevance. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate planning paradox facing the agency. On one side of the coin, you need rigid stability. Palestine refugees are depending on predictable education and health services day in and day out. Staff need clear, unchanging objectives. But on the exact flip side, you have to be hyper-adaptable to absorb a sudden conflict, mass displacement, or huge funding shocks. The strategy has to be firm enough to guide millions of dollars in resources, yet flexible enough to bend, not snap, when a massive crisis hits. It's a real balancing act. Which brings us to Section 2, Scarcity and Crisis, Transparent Trade-offs. Now we're shifting our focus to how leadership handles those incredibly tough situations where the math simply does not add up. The intense decisions required when massive humanitarian needs drastically outpace the actual resources available. It's brutal, and it requires incredibly transparent trade-offs. 50. Take a second to think about that number. That is the number of distinct, expanded areas of action for the Director of Planning laid out here. It is a massive volume of strategic action points, and together they represent a comprehensive survival roadmap to keep the agency's vital operations afloat. Every single one of these 50 points addresses a totally different leadership dimension. We're talking everything from mandate alignment and data governance, right down to crisis adaptation and maintaining donor confidence. It's all about making sure there are absolutely zero blind spots in the agency's resilience. So how does that actually work? Well, it all builds into a highly systematic, results-based roadmap. The Director of Planning is essentially acting as an organizational architect here. Step 1 is setting the medium-term strategy. But, an abstract strategy is kind of useless without step 2, the annual implementation work plans. And then those work plans are strictly tied to step 3, aligned budget cycles. It's this continuous, systematic process of connecting high-level strategic intent all the way down to the actual physical dollars being spent on the ground. It ensures that budgets reflect actual strategic priorities, not just historical inertia, doing things the way they've always been done. But of course, even the absolute best budgets face disruption in this environment. That's exactly why the guide places such a heavy emphasis on institutionalizing scenario planning. In practical, everyday terms, this means the agency is preparing its decision pathways well in advance. They establish crystal clear triggers for best case, most likely, and worst case outcomes. By having these pathways already mapped out, a sudden security issue or access disruption doesn't just completely derail the whole mission. The leadership team already knows their pivot points before the crisis even peaks. They're ready. Now let's look at Section 3, Protecting the Vulnerable, a Living System. Here is where we really transition from talking about budgets and spreadsheets to actual human lives. The strategic guide is very clear that UNRWA is not just a collection of administrative silos. It's a living, breathing system. Relief, health, education, social services, they are all deeply intertwined. And the ultimate goal of all this complex planning architecture? It's the protection of the most vulnerable communities who are facing repeated, exhausting shocks. To really see this living system in action, we need to look at how this planning actively protects specific groups. It starts right off the bat with gender equality. And I don't mean as an abstract policy or some corporate buzzword, but by actually integrating the exact specific needs of women, girls, men, and boys directly into their targets, their vulnerability analysis, and their daily service accountability. Keeping that momentum going, it also means a hardcore commitment to ensuring disability inclusion. Whenever they're planning services, whether that's physically building a brand new clinic or launching digital learning platforms for students, the data and the budgets absolutely must account for reasonable accommodations. It's all about preserving the dignity and accessibility for persons with disabilities at every touch point. And rounding this out, the strategic guide actually looks past the immediate day-to-day relief efforts to actively build future opportunities. It heavily prioritizes youth employability. How? By directly connecting all this organizational planning to technical and vocational education and training, or TVET. By intentionally planning for future skills and livelihood opportunities, the agency manages to balance those desperate, immediate life-saving needs with the longer-term human development outcomes for the entire next generation. Which leads us to our final core theme, Section 4, Modern Ecosystems, Innovation and Data. Look, to manage all of this complexity effectively today, the tools of the past just aren't going to cut it anymore. Future-proofing an agency of this size means radically modernizing the planning ecosystem through real innovation and rigorous data governance. So the guide actively mandates a full-scale digital transformation. It's moving the agency away from those slow, fragmented paper trails and pushing them into highly connected, interoperable digital platforms and real-time performance dashboards. It's automating workflows. And what this does is replace ambiguity with continuous feedback loops. It guarantees that senior leadership is getting actionable, incredibly concise intelligence exactly when they need it most. The data they use for planning suddenly becomes this reliable, timely asset, rather than just a pile of outdated paperwork sitting on a desk. Which really leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question to chew on. Can data actually predict the next crisis? As this planning function fully embraces things like AI and advanced analytics, it opens up some truly incredible possibilities for predictive modeling and forecasting. Advanced analytics will undoubtedly shape the entire future of humanitarian forecasting. However, and this is a big however, they were designed to equip leadership with structured options, not to replace the absolutely crucial empathetic human judgment that's required when actual lives are on the line. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How will this fusion of advanced technology and profound human resilience redefine crisis management in the years to come?